Hey, everybody, this is Chuck Marone with Strong Towns. Welcome back to the Strong Towns podcast. You have seen the videos from Not Just Bikes. If you've not seen the videos from Not Just Bikes, you need to go on YouTube and watch all of them right now. You will be there for the next many, many hours, and you will find that well worth your time. Jason Slaughter is the creator behind Not Just Bikes. He's been on the podcast before. Jason, welcome back to Strong Towns.
Thanks so much, Chuck. It's really good to be here again.
It's cool to chat with you.
Yeah.
You did one of your latest videos, and I think we tried to record this a few weeks ago, but
it's going to be ancient by the time anyone hears this.
Yeah, it's a few weeks old now, but because you've had a couple more that are really good. But the one I wanted to talk to you about really badly is titled "America Always Gets This Wrong When Building Transit." Describe American transit for me. You say in the video, bad, efficient, inefficient, slow. Let me give you the floor and just talk about American transit and contrast that with the transit that you're living with do we call you an expat? I don't know what we call you living in
I usually call myself an immigrant, to be honest, because an expat is a person who is typically on a limited time thing and plans to come home, if you will. And I do not plan to come.
So you have a new home in Amsterdam, but yes, you're very familiar with North America. So
of course, yes. And I've lived in the US and I've lived in Canada.
Give us a rundown of transit over here and contrast that with over there.
Yeah, so I've taken transit many times in the U.S. and in Canada, but when I think of the typical North American transit experience, I think back to when I was a teenager before I had my driver's license, and I had these buses that said they would come every half hour or every hour or every 45 minutes, but that could be anywhere plus or minus another half hour on top of that, and then two buses would come at once. Yes, I can't tell you how many times in my life I stood out in the cold at one of those bus shelters or at a metal stick in the ground, staring off down the road, thinking, how much longer is this going to be? And I mean, that's the transit experience in a lot of the U.S. and Canada, with very few exceptions. I mean, there are some places where you could take transit to get to where you're going, you know, if you were in New York City or in Chicago or something like that. But the majority of places, you're going to be reliant on a bus that is not going to come on time, and it's going to get stuck in traffic, and it's probably going to be an older bus that's clunking along, and it's not a good experience. Whereas, you know, when I think about taking transit now, and I take it on a regular basis, it's clean and it's efficient, and you know, I tap my card and I go. And even since that video was made, I spent a week in Switzerland, and that's to a whole other level on top of that. And I recently just released a video this week about the experience of taking the train in Switzerland. You know, where you've got buses and trams, and they're coming by so often you don't even need to look at a schedule. You just show up. You know, you know what destination you're going to. You just show up. The vehicle comes there, it takes you off, you connect to somewhere else. And in the case of the Netherlands and in Switzerland, the timetables are scheduled so that when one vehicle arrives, the next one's about to leave 5 minutes later, and you get there on time. You go to your next train or your next tram or your next bus or your next gondola, and it takes you off to where you want to go. And it's, you know, it's clean and efficient. You don't have to think about it too much. I mean, it's a night and day experience. And I get, you know, I run a YouTube channel about my experiences living in different places in the world, and about urban planning and the reasons for this. And urban planning is one of those topics that everyone seems to have an opinion on, but most people know very little about it. And so you know, a lot of people come with these missing expectations about why is it this way. Anyway, but we can get into it, the history of it in the U.S. and everything else.
It feels like, I think my experience, both in Europe and here in the US, it has to deal with the floor and the ceiling on how good does something get versus how poor something is. Mm-hmm. And you can go to Washington, D.C., you can go to New York, and you can have what I think, and I think you would agree with this, would be good transit service. Not amazing, not great,
yeah.
But good transit service, right?
Yeah.
But the floor here in the US is so ridiculous. I've literally seen benches on the side of a 6-lane stroad
Yep.
with no sidewalk, surrounded by a ditch. That is a legit, like this is a bus, like a bus actually stops here twice a day.
Yep.
Um, the floor in Europe is nowhere near that, right? I mean, if we were going to say like, what is the worst transit experience you could possibly have in Europe, not as an anomaly, like something breaks. I've been on a bus that broke down once, and
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. But something that would be a daily expectation. The floor is, there's just no, like, I don't even know any, African or Asian countries that would have a lower floor as we do here in the US. Can you talk a little bit about the floor? How low
Yeah,
can
I
it
mean,
go?
the floor in Europe is not going to be anywhere close to the floor in the United States. Oh my God, no. First of all, you'd have to be in a very low population place. Like, I think one of the big distinctions is that you could have a very low floor of service in somewhere like Atlanta, which is a very large city with millions of people living there. Which, if you take any city that size in Asia or in Europe, it's just you're just not going to have that low level of service. So first, in order to look at the sort of worst service you'd get, you'd have to be in an area of very low population. So some village somewhere or some small town or something like that. And then you would expect that the only transit would be some kind of a bus that would take you to the nearest train station, and maybe it only goes once an hour or something like that. But that's kind of what you're talking about. Whereas, the town I grew up in London, Ontario, Canada, routinely has buses that only come once an hour, and it's a city with 430,000 people.
Right,
Um,
right. I feel like that was to me, just from an experiential level. And I guess I wanted to start there because it feels like the idea of raising the floor off of such a low bar should not be that difficult here,
no,
right?
it really
I mean,
shouldn't.
like the feedback, and you start with this in the video, the idea that we don't have enough people here to have good transit, or we don't have the
Yeah.
density to
Yeah.
have good transit.
Yeah.
You brought up London, fake London, as you call it. I mean, I love the I don't know if people find you funny or not. You're my kind of humor. Like, I don't think my kids would find you funny because they don't find me funny.
My
But
kids don't find me funny either.
okay, well, we have that in common then. Talk a little bit about this idea that you have to have a certain critical mass of people in order to even ponder a transit system.
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing that kind of kicked off the video and the reason why it exists. And this actually plays off of some previous videos that I've done, where these kind of objections come out. So there's a couple of things. One of them was about a stroad in my hometown called Wonderland Road. I made a video about it, where Wonderland Road is 4 lanes plus turning lanes. It's rammed with traffic every day, and the city wants to do something about it. So they looked into widening it from 4 lanes to 6 lanes.
Make it a true wonderland, right?
Exactly, a
Right.
true wonderland. Yes. Oh my God.
so aptly named.
The project was called Discover Wonderland. Like, really, turning a 4-lane stroad to a 6-lane stroad is called Discover Wonderland. And I made this video about this, saying like, this is bonkers, but it was also the largest infrastructure project in history for my hometown. Widening a 4-lane stroad to a 6-lane stroad, the largest infrastructure project in history, which is insane to me. And anyway, the city eventually decided they couldn't do it. They said it was for environmental reasons, but when you really look into it, a lot of it just came down to cost. They just can't afford this. And so then they were looking at what's the alternative, blah, blah, blah. And there's all this talk about that. And I was even on the radio in my hometown to discuss this, and they were saying, well, what would you do about it? And there's nothing you can do about Wonderland Road in isolation. Like, it is not about Wonderland Road. Wonderland Road is a 4-lane stroad in a city that is designed with like a sea of asphalt. So so you can't just say what's the fix to Wonderland Road. There is no fix to just Wonderland Road. It gets into a larger conversation because my city also, over the past, geez, it's been 10 years now, has been talking about a rapid transit plan. So this is a city with 430,000 people. You can look it up, London, Ontario, Canada. And it has no rapid transit at all. The only transit that exists in that city is buses that share the road with cars and that get stuck in traffic. And frequencies on those buses are, every half hour or something like that. And it may be possible that there's some higher frequency routes, but it's not good coverage. It doesn't go where you want to go, and it doesn't come often.
Can we when you say rapid transit,
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are people who are listening who they put in their mind high speed rail.
Right.
You're not talking anything like that. You're just
Absolutely
talking like reliable, frequent service is what you're
Yes.
talking about.
And in particular, even buses in their own right of way, a BRT system, a bus rapid transit would be,
Yes.
I would consider rapid transit. In the case of my hometown, they were talking about an LRT, light rail transit, which, Europeans would call trams, but whatever. This is the new name because streetcars have a bad name in North America, usually because they got stuck in traffic all the time. And, you think
we had to take them out. Right.
Yeah, you got to take them out. Streetcars have a bad name, so we got to call them LRTs now. But so they had talked about an LRT plan, which was going to be fairly simple, like a cross structure going through downtown, one east-west, one north-south, LRT. Pretty simple stuff, really. But then they decided that the ridership numbers weren't high enough. And there was always this discussion in there saying, we don't have the population for an LRT. I mean, an LRT, And this is where in the video, I went through the list of cities in Germany. I made a typo, which is great because got lots of comments on that. But anyway, made a list of all the cities in Germany. I think there were 40 cities in Germany with a lower population than my hometown. There were even a couple that I didn't include because their metro population was a little bigger. So there's about 40 cities and they have trams, right? And of course they have trams. You don't need a huge population to have trams. I think the lowest on that list was 10,000 people or 20,000 people. But there's this constant talk in Canada, and I've heard it in the US as well, but I mostly follow this in Canada, where they say we don't have the population for an LRT. And it's stuck in people's minds that these Strode-filled exurbs and suburbs are these, I don't know, people think of them as like these pastoral villages or something, and these rural places that that's a city thing. Us folk over here can't have an LRT, and it just seems really bizarre to me because it really is not about the these cities are, look, the point is these cities are more than large enough to have a tram like that. And so then the question is, what is it that's holding
why
them
don't
back,
they?
right? Why don't they?
I wanted to tell you something, and I don't think this will surprise you. It might surprise some of the people listening. Brainerd, Minnesota, my hometown, where I'm sitting right now, 13,500 people today, 13,500 people at the end of World War II, right? So we've had the same population today as we had back then. Of course, we have dial-a-ride now, which is like a big, it's a small bus that you call, and then it's like a glorified taxi service. It is the worst of transit, actually. Back before, I want to say it was until the 1950s, we had a streetcar line that went from our south of town through the downtown, then went over to the northeast out to where the paper mill was, where the big employer was, and then went back. And people who live south of town could take it to work. Anybody in the northeast or the south could take it to the downtown, and it went back and forth all day. It was electric. It ran on a rail. The rail is still there. Like every now and then we do a project and dig up the old rail line. My little town had this. It was one of these things where it always blows my mind when people say we're too small for it, because I'm like, what actually is too small? Like, I don't get that idea. It's not size, right? It's something else.
Exactly.
What is that something else? I mean, what if we were going to try to categorize it? What would it be?
Yeah, and I think people will say that something else is density, but I don't even think density is the right word.
I agree
Um,
with you 100%. Yeah.
yeah, it's not because when as soon as you start talking about density, people think Manhattan skyscrapers and things like
Hmm.
that. It's not even about density. I've been to places that would, I mean, they're certainly more dense than a sea of single family homes, but you wouldn't call them dense. It really comes down to the land use around transit, and that's fundamentally what the video is about. And this is what I really wanted to get to people because I had touched on this in my Wonderland Road video. I had touched on this in my business parks video, but it just wasn't sinking in with people about like it's all about the land use around transit. And what I argue in there is that rapid transit needs good land use, but also good land use needs rapid transit. And you simply can't have one without the other. They are absolutely linked together because what you have to look at with transit, and I think you mentioned this in your book, that you can look at that kind of transit as like a walking accelerator, right? So you've got a walkable neighborhood where you've got most of the things you need within walking distance of your house. And that's fine. But every once in a while, you're going to need to go a little bit farther. Or maybe there's something that, it's walkable, but it might take you 25 minutes. And so you hop on a tram or you hop on a bus to get there. And it's a walking accelerator. But the idea is that when you get out at that stop, you're still in a walkable area. Maybe in between it could be farms for all I know. But the point is when you get off of that rapid transit stop, you're somewhere where you can walk to your destination. And fundamentally, this is what we're missing in North America. Because if I think about, even if they did build a um, a light rail or a bus rapid transit that dropped you off at Wonderland Road, it would drop you off at the side of a 4, maybe someday 6 lane strode at the edge of a parking lot. And that's insane. I mean, then that's fundamentally the problem. I mean, nobody is going to take that. So it's nothing to do with the population of the city and everything to do with when you step off that transit vehicle, where are you?
Can I quote you?
Yeah.
And again, I laughed out loud. You said successful transit needs two things: people to ride it and destinations people want to go. And and it's here's why it's so funny, because it's like you're explaining how paperclip works, right? Like, let me guide you through this.
I know. And I think I said in
It,
the video, startling revelations here, like,
yes, yes.
but that's the level of discourse.
I feel like it is the level of discourse, and I'm going to say this. I know you. Okay, I know you acknowledge that you're not like some licensed, trained professional doing transit studies and planning. I get it, granted, but I feel like this is a level of discourse often inside transit agencies too. Like I feel like there's a lot of people who say, well, of course we get that. But when you start like developing the projects and looking at things, those two very simple precepts seem to get divorced from any reality of how we actually make things work.
Hmm.
Um, talk a little bit about your videos are so compelling. I mean, there's a reason why 900,000 people have watched this transit video. It's a really good video. You show the pictures of the sidewalks people are expected to walk across, the parking lots people are expected to walk across, the massive transit investments that are literally surrounded by parking lot and you know many kilometers, as you would say, many miles for Americans from anything you would actually want to go to.
Hmm.
Do you is this an experience you ever have in the Netherlands? Is this an experience you ever have anywhere else? Is this just unique to us in North America?
Honestly, I can't imagine a transit vehicle dropping me off on and expecting me to walk like that. Like in almost any other place I've been to in the world. I mean, I can remember a bus I took in Mexico that cost me $1.50 or something, and was a 1970s school bus from America that had been painted in fancy colors. And they dropped me off at the edge of a road and said it's just down there. I mean, that's the kind of level I'm thinking about here, though. Like in In a transit agency within a city, that's just it's insane.
Mhm.
And sometimes I wonder when I'm experiencing these things and I'm making these videos, I'm like, do other people not get this, that this is a problem? Like, so one of the things I featured in that video was there's a project in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, a suburb of Toronto, where I used to live and work. Um, and they have a project called the Transitway, which is a bus rapid transit, and it's actually built to a great spec, and it's fantastic. I had made a video about my experience being in a business park in Mississauga, and I worked there. I took the bus every day because I was a poor student, and that was a horrible experience to take that bus. And when I
I
made
have
that
this
video,
image of you doing it, actually.
oh my God,
I could picture you walking along this nasty stroad, just
right,
like
exactly.
your soul being crushed.
Well,
Poor Jason.
there is a reason why my channel exists, because these experiences that I lived through for so many years of my life. And I mean, I had always just think, well, this is the way it is, right? If you don't like it, get a car. And and since living in Asia and living in Europe, I'm like, what the hell? Why did I ever need to go through this? But anyway, when I made that video, I got pushback from some people saying, hey, we have a good BRT here too. We have this Mississauga Transitway, and again, it's built to a really great spec, and the stations are like really nice, and they have these like well manicured gardens out front, and it costs a lot of money. It was over $500 million Canadian to build it, and and some of the stations have something around it that you might want to go to. Not, but this thing's been around since I think it was 2014, I said. And that one station that I filmed, the one that theoretically, if I had still lived in Mississauga and if I still worked in that business park, I would have to get out at this particular station. That's why I featured it. When you walk out of this beautiful station with the concrete and glass and metal, and you step out, you're on a four-lane intersection of two four-lane stroads, and the sidewalk, it's like 30 centimeters wide, which I don't know. You can say whatever that is in inches. I don't know, but it's like a foot.
Right.
It's like it's crazy. Like I step out of this $500 million project onto this. I mean, it's barely a curb next to high speed traffic, and I have to walk a kilometer along this to get to where my office was. And I looked at this, after getting all the flack from people about, well, we have BRT here too, and you're not really being fair. And I went and looked at this, and I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you people? Like this is not acceptable at all. This drops me off at a corner where there's of nothing and nothing. In the video, I showed that across the street there were some houses, but it's the back of the houses with their fences. You can't go into the neighborhood that way. So any way you go from that transit stop, you have to walk along, choose your stroad. And and this has been around since 2014, and it's still like this. And I look at this and I think, like, how did anybody anywhere along the path that requires the approval of a 500 and whatever it is $1 million project not look at this and say, this is insane? And so when I'm talking about, transit needs good land use, this isn't even just bad land use. This is atrocious land use. This is completely and totally unacceptable land use. And we get surprised in North America that nobody takes transit. I mean, of course they don't take transit. Why would anybody who can afford a car do that?
Right. You just said something that I know will rile up some people, because there is this, well, in the book, I call it a charitable overlay, transit as a charitable
Yes.
overlay to the
Yes.
rest of the transportation system. And people got very upset with me about that, because it's like, you're disrespecting people. You're not. And I'll say this from my vantage point. I feel like our transit systems disrespect people. I feel like we treat them as charitable overlays, and the result of that is that the people building and designing and working on them are delivering systems that don't really think about the end user and treat them with respect. We treat it as if this is charity, so be happy with the scraps you get.
I mean, if anybody, says that I'm disrespecting these people. I am absolutely not disrespecting these people. I was these people. And and
Hmm.
you are absolutely correct that this is disrespectful to them. And when I'm talking about when I talked about the Mississauga Transitway, this is really great transit by North American standards. I mean, this is dedicated transit in its own right of way with brand new stations. This is great. Um, and but that's not the case for most people in North America. They don't get that. Most people in North America get a hole in the ground next to the side of the Strode. Maybe it's paved, maybe it's not. And it's got a little sign on it that says the route number of the bus, and that's it. That's what they're given. And it is so incredibly disrespectful because you're riding on this poorly maintained bus in most cases. It's clunking along. It's got diesel fumes coming out of it. It's a very unpleasant experience. It's jostling back and forth. But I think, even if you bought newer buses, you drop people off in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, really, honestly, is that acceptable? Like I've shown in other videos in my hometown where maybe there's a bench, but it's a bench and then it's another, half kilometer across parking lots to get to
Right.
anywhere you want to go.
Right.
And I mean, this is completely and totally unacceptable.
So let me throw you a curve. Um, and I'll maybe make this an offer to you because I would love to have you come visit sometime. Uh, the best middle class transit. So let's take New York and DC, Chicago. Let's take it out of the mix and say where is the best middle class transit? And by middle class, I mean the transit that a typical or even like an above typical median income family will gladly ride and feel joyous and happy doing it. Where is this in North America? And I'm going to answer my own question. Okay, it's at Disney World.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever been, but ridiculous. I sit and watch people because I'm fascinated by the transportation system. You've got the monorail, you've got boats, you've got buses. They have high frequency, they have reliability, they drop you off right at the door, they deliver you from destination to destination. And the fascinating thing about it is that people who would in normal circumstances absolutely despise and fight against and devalue the types of investments that deliver that, pay massive amount, like insane amounts of money to go and live for a week in Wonderland, literally not Wonderland Road, but literally Wonderland, where they can go from a high density living place with, mixed use development, get on a bus, go to a shopping area, get on a bus, go to a recreation area, and they do it with ease and they pay a premium to be able to do it.
Yeah.
I don't feel like this is the broken humans rejecting this lifestyle. I feel like this is the humans rejecting what has been delivered to them, but also being kind of force fed a diet of auto-oriented type of design.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the auto-oriented and go ahead and react
Yeah.
to that? And
Well, I
give us
think there's two things I would say to that. The first, and I hear this all the time in transit discourse in North America. The first is that people make the assumption that because a certain type of transit does not work where they live, that type of transit does not work. That is a
right.
very, very common thing. Like people will say, like, "Oh, come on, it'll take me 2.5 hours to take the bus, but I could drive there in 35 minutes. Therefore, buses are terrible." And I'm like, no, the way that your city has been designed and the way your transportation infrastructure is designed is terrible. Buses work just fine in lots of places in the world, and so do trams, and so do trains, and everything else. And it really does come down to this. Sorry, the other thing I was going to say about the Disneyland is that I constantly hear from North Americans who go on vacation to Europe and they have such a lovely time, and you hear them talk about it and like, oh, there was this great cafe just down the street from our hotel, and we got on the tube or we got on the tram, and it took us right to this wonderful little place, and then they come back to their strode lined hellscape, as I like to call it,
Uh-huh.
and and they fight, for every last parking spot and, every
Hey,
bike
Target
lane.
has a Starbucks now. Yeah.
I know, right? And it's just it's there's this mentality there that oh, that's there and this is here and we can't be like that. And you hear it also in the discourse. It's like, oh, Europe's old, and they have these medieval streets, so of course they could do this. Well, most of Amsterdam was built after 1960. The
Right.
vast majority of the land area of Amsterdam was built after 1960. We have the towns of Almere and Lelystad that were built on reclaimed land. They were both built in the 1980s, and they're not like this. I mean, it's not about that at all. But people get it in their heads that this is there and that is there, and these things have to be different. But it really does come down to the choices that have been made to make things car centric. I mean, and like I talked about in the video, coming back then, that it really is good transit, good land use have to come together. When your restrictions in your city require minimum parking requirements, when they require these big lane roads, when every time you want to put in a shop, you need to have the parking and then you need to do the traffic study in order to widen the roads enough for the expected amount of traffic, that determines what that land use is going to be. That your hands are tied here as to what you could actually build, even if you were a developer. And the number of problems with this are huge. I mean, banks don't want to finance something different because there's a risk and everything else, as you well know, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know. But even if you were a developer that says, look, I want to build the most wonderful, walkable development that the world has ever seen, you will just come up to every single step of the way. There is something in there that has been put in to make things car friendly that you have to overcome. And so when then you end up with the Wonderland Road problem, where you've gone and you've built this with wide roads, you've gone and built this with free parking and too much parking, you've gone and built this so that there's literally no other way to get around but a car, and then you suddenly fill up your roads, and then you're suddenly broke, and then you can't deal with your traffic. And then you come and look at, say, oh, well, transit actually seems to work really well over there in Europe, so why don't we just add some transit, sprinkle a little transit on here and the problem is solved. And I think I called it the transit band-aid in the
Transit
video.
Band-Aid, yeah.
But that's the way it's approached. It's approached as like, we hit this wall that we've run ourselves into because of we've designed literally everything exclusively for cars. So now where do we stick the transit? And that was exactly the frustrating part of my interview with CBC Radio London, where they said, well, if you had infinite money, what would you do with Wonderland Road? And I'm like, how do I even begin to answer that question? I mean, like, yeah. Anyway,
right.
and the truth is, like, it's so much more than Wonderland Road. It's so much more than any road in any city in North America. It really comes down to land use. We need to go back to this idea that you can build a building and not have to stick 6 parking lots next to it. We have to get this idea that you can build something and not need to widen this road. It's like, we need to design at a human scale. We need to design for walking first. And the major thing I advocate on my channel is everything needs to be designed for walking, and then everything else that you need needs to be added in so much as it's compatible with walking.
Yeah. Let me quote you. I felt like this. Okay, you have a gift for framing things and explaining things in a simple way, in a way that resonates. I write a chapter in a book, and I feel like you summarize it in 2 sentences. I might just let you write the next one.
Yeah, I could be your editor, but then it'll just be a pamphlet.
A transit plan without a land use plan is a waste of time and resources.
Yeah.
But a land use plan without transit is a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
That first part was like, I get it. And I that made a lot of sense. The second part of it being a lost opportunity is one that as soon as you say it, I'm like, yes, I'm with you. But I think it's something that, the people deeply immersed in transit often struggle to do the land use part. The people who are really deep in land use, which is kind of where I started with this, struggle often to integrate the transit part in. You brought up new urbanism, and I think quite fairly, new urbanists build beautiful places, when they're not connected to transit, lost opportunity.
Yes.
I want to give you just a couple minutes to elaborate on that, because I felt like this dichotomy of a waste of time and resources and a lost opportunity really got at something powerful. Because when I look at London, when I look at Mississauga, when I look at Wonderland Road, I'm seeing all the pieces, right? I see all the ingredients. All the ingredients are there. They're just arranged and aligned and constructed in a way that squanders our wealth and squanders our opportunity.
Yeah.
Go elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, and this is what I actually really liked about the things that you've written about transit and what you wrote in your book, but also in your articles on Strong Towns over the previous years, where you really talk about this idea that we have these walkable places, and they certainly exist in London, Ontario. There's two examples that I use in the video. One of them is the downtown, which was, oh my God, it makes me cry when I look at historical photos of what that place used to look like. It was stunningly beautiful.
Yes.
You know, it's funny when I was talking about it compared to Swiss cities. Somebody said, well, you know, that's because they get so many tourists there. And I was like, well, you know, if this place still looked like that, we'd get tourists too, right?
Yeah.
People would flock from all over North America to come see what our downtown used to look like.
That's exactly right.
So the bones of it are still there, but a lot of it is surface parking lots now. And then the other one was a place called Wortley Village, which is just it used to be its own little downtown, own little village, and then it was annexed by London in the late 19th century or something like that. But the point is, we have these places, and they exist, and they're decaying, right? You've seen it in Brainerd. Everybody has seen it. If they've been to any old downtown in almost any place in North America, they've seen it. It's there. How do we fix these places, right? And Strong Towns has the best advice for fixing these places that I've read anywhere, which is why I send people over to you all the time. But I think the transit is the big important piece here, because you have this opportunity for a mixed-use, walkable place. We could bring these places back, but ultimately they need to be connected to the other good places that still exist. And we need the walking extenders, the transit, to get us between these places. So if you could live in one of these places, in one of these older style neighborhoods, and you could conceivably take a bus or a tram that leaves so frequently you don't need to look at a schedule, and you know, and you can rely on it to get you to the other place downtown, which is the place that you could work or shop, then this is really fundamentally what transit can do. And this is the wealth multiplier that you talk about so often in Strong Towns, that transit can be that wealth multiplier, because now it brings value to that place, because then that place is not an island anymore. Now that place is connected to another place, and it's connected by transit. And I think that's the real opportunity that we're missing out on in North America.
It feels like people have tried to address this problem here with what is called transit-oriented development. Mm-hmm. This idea that we will get really smart people who will come in and they will not only build the transit, but they'll build the land use around it. And we can solve these problems and not have such ridiculous outcomes if we do it this way. Or we can go into all these transit stations we've built surrounded by parking lots, and now we'll intensely develop them. And there's a part of me that immediately says, yes, like this is part of the answer, right? Like this has got to be. But the video you have tapped into exactly what my hesitation on all of this is, showing the pictures of the big towers right next to the single family homes. And I'm just thinking about the army of NIMBYs that are being built around these stations because we are, incapable of doing things in, I'm gonna say, a moderate way. I think moderate is maybe the wrong word, because we're talking about something that would be a degree of change. But talk a little bit about the effect of transit-oriented development here in the US and mm-hmm. how that differs from the other places you've experienced around the world, where I don't think you are minting NIMBYs as you build these things out.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is also something that Strong Towns has mentioned that I hope to make a video about someday, where you talk about like no neighborhood should be exempt from change, but no neighborhood should undergo radical change. And I think that's just
Right.
an absolutely fantastic statement. Um, it, it we do have this problem though, that many neighborhoods have not undergone change for 70, 80 years. And there is this pent up demand. There's a housing crisis like we've never seen. And we have this issue where we need to build, and so transit oriented development seems like the obvious way to do it. I often joke when talking about transit oriented development that, people say, what is transit oriented development like in other parts of the world? And I'm like, it's just the way you build things. It doesn't have a word, it doesn't have a name. It's just of course that's what you do. Like
Right.
it's so bizarre to even have a term for it. It's like we've gone so far in one direction towards car supremacy that we need a term to to
For
say
normal.
what we've done
Right.
forever. Um, so that's the way I feel about that. But again, yeah, the problem is that we've got these situation, and I think the example I used in Toronto is really fantastic, because there is a subway line, and they don't have a lot of them, but there is a major subway line that goes through Yonge Street, and then they are building across Eglinton an LRT that opens next year, and it's a really big deal. It's Toronto hasn't had a lot of rapid transit, and this is the biggest rapid transit project that they had in a long time. And this is a city with over 2 million people, the largest city in Canada. The Anyway, so they're building this and they're doing transit oriented development, but what they do in Toronto is what they call the avenues plan, which is they take the big avenue, they take the Eglinton, they take the Yonge, and they densify the avenues. Of course, when the pressure has been built up so much in the housing market, as soon as you let the pressure out in one spot, it bursts out, right? And that's exactly what you see. These huge towers go up because there's such a pent up demand for housing. And finally, you release it of its, exclusive single family zoning, and a developer will come in, and obviously they want that plot of land, but they're not going to go and build a townhouse on that piece of land. They're not going to build a 3 or 4 story apartment building as you'd see in Europe. That would be insane. The pressure is so high that they build a 30-story condo tower. But because they've only densified the avenues, you can go literally one block in from the avenue, and there it is, the single family homes right there. And you can be literally a 2-minute walk from a transit station, the busiest subway in the city, and the newest, biggest rapid transit project in the city, and you've got a single family home there. And it's just like, I I get it. You don't want to undergo radical change, but the problem is we've built up so much pressure here by not having change for so long that we get these crazy situations. Whereas if you looked at that kind of situation in Europe, and I used an example in the video about Eiberg, which is a piece of reclaimed land in Amsterdam near the center, and they built it, the tram and the buildings were built at the same time. So the tram actually opened just as the first residents were moving in. So they built their lives around transit, as I said. But the whole area there is, of course, walkable, and there are actually that there aren't detached single family homes, but there are single family townhomes in that area. There are apartment buildings that are about 3 stories high. There are a variety of buildings around this area, and they are for all kinds of people. There are units, single bedroom units for single people. There are townhomes for larger families. There's everything like that, and it's all within walking distance of this tram line. There's not a single high rise in the area, and there's nothing particularly wrong with high rises. I don't have an issue with condo towers, and I've lived in them myself in downtown Toronto. But to to have those extremes is what I see in North America. It's only the extremes. Either you live in the single family home, or you live in the 30 story condo tower, and there's nothing in between. Whereas in Europe, there's only in between. You in a new neighborhood like that. I mean, you can find single family detached homes in Europe. They'll be a little bit out of town and fine. But when you're building a new development like this, there's going to be townhomes, there's going to be apartment buildings, but it's only going to be that middle. It's neither going to be the extreme on either side. And it's just so different and in the whole approach to everything. And I think this is this narrative I just get so annoyed with, this response that I get from people in North America when I say maybe we should build something other than single family homes, and they'll say I don't want to live in a concrete box in the sky, like as if
Right.
there's nothing in between those two things.
Right. There's
But
two choices
I can't
on
really
the
blame
shelf.
them because when you walk around their cities, that's what you see.
Mhm. It occurs to me as you were discussing this, just how um, that that dichotomy, or that flood of capital into the avenues, is
Hmm.
actually enhanced by the fact that the design of the avenue, which are typically like Strode designs, actually devalue the land along it. It makes it so you don't want to live along it, and it almost creates this situation where we'll build towers uh, to house people who can't afford single family homes, or are in the period of their life cycle where
Hmm.
they were not able to get into that single family home when it was priced, in a good way. Um, and for everybody else, you get, like you say, a block. You're 2 blocks from the transit station, with your own built-in NIMBY zoning codes and what have you to fight the next iteration of building a walkable place. That this seems like the most dysfunctional way to build transit.
Hmm.
Um, Yet I quite frankly don't see people doing it well here in North America. I'm sure that people listening can send in examples of like, oh, we've got it figured out and we're doing this well, but I have not experienced that, and I've experienced a lot of North American transit.
Yeah, I mean, I referenced a video by City Beautiful, who is an urban planner.
Yeah.
He's a great YouTube channel. He had been to Portland and seen it done correctly. So I do believe that it's possible to do it correctly, but it's
Well,
certainly not common.
let me use Portland as an example for this last question I want to ask you, because I
Yep.
I feel like the tension that I always get into with transit advocates and transit planners and other people who really want to see more trains built, particularly, is the phasing question.
Yeah.
Um, what do we do first, and how should we lead? And I, I feel like your video points out really well that this is not an either or a first and they go together. The land use and transit goes together. Agreed. I get it. But I look at Portland and I see Portland held up as like an example of a city doing this really well. I've been to Portland and I've seen lots of transit stops with nothing around them.
Yeah.
We made the investment and now we're going to develop it, but it's been decades later and it's still not developed. I also see in Portland how their radical upzoning in a transit-oriented development mindset has not only resulted in the tower next to a single-family home kind of thing that we see in other places, but it's actually stagnated the single-family home market, because single-family homes are not worth they're not worth turning into a duplex or a quad unit or responding incrementally to the density, because you've got this massive, or the demand, because you have this massive transit investment now.
Hmm.
The only really viable thing for that is a tower. And so it will sit there and stagnate for 10 years, 20
Yep.
years until someone buys it and does the really intense thing there. Um, Talk a little bit about phasing, and I'm particularly interested in how you would do phasing in the Netherlands. You mentioned a couple new towns that were built and how they turned out differently than what you would
Yeah.
expect to see here. Why does that happen that way? Do you know? I mean, I'm assuming it's more than just a culture. I'm assuming that there's something going on behind the scenes that actually delivers this as more of a complete product than the bifurcation that we have here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that the Netherlands does it perfect every time, but there have been whole towns here that have been built on reclaimed land and neighborhoods that were built on reclaimed land, and these are all new, brand new. And in the case of Iberg, it was built in 2014, I believe it was.
When you say, just out of curiosity, when you say reclaimed land, you're talking about former
Literally
ocean,
taken from the
right?
sea. Yes,
Yeah.
literally,
Okay.
like where most of the Netherlands comes from.
Right. Right. So I just want to make sure we're talking about the same, because I think a lot when we say reclaimed land here, it's like, well, this used to be a landfill, or this used to be
Right.
like
It used to
a
be a
brownfield
gas
site.
station or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, exactly. So reclaim from the sea land.
Right.
But it does mean that there's actually quite a few places here in the Netherlands that are new, that are very new, and they build them this way. Why do they do it this way? It's a wide range of well, there's even regulations in the case of the Netherlands that they try to preserve farmland, for instance, because actually the Netherlands is a fairly large agricultural country, and so that there are, just as developers' hands are tied in the United States around having to build things in a car dependent way, and sometimes you're having to build things in a don't destroy the farms kind of way,
Yeah.
or allow there to be farms here still kind of way. So there is an element of that, um, but it really comes down to like practicality. If you're building a new city or you're building a new neighborhood, you're going to move a bunch of people into it, and ultimately those people need to connect to the rest of the city, and those people are going to have transportation needs, and so there is typically a transportation option that is built alongside any new development that is scaled to what they believe to be the needs of that development, at least for the near future. So, in the case of Iberg, they had talked about making it a metro for what it's worth, and they decided to make it a tram. And there were various people that said that was the wrong decision and that it's going to be quite busy. What they did is they started out with a tram, and then they've added a second tram to the end of it, right? They made it a train tram, if you will, and so that carries more people. They run the trams a little bit more often. I mean, you can move a lot of people on a tram. But that has been successful, and there is still a housing crisis here as well, and they still have a need for more, and so they are extending it. They're reclaiming more land from the sea farther down from that tram line, and they're going to build upon that. Um, in terms of the staging, I think actually a city that did it well was Ottawa in Canada. I lived there on an internship in the '90s, and they had built a BRT system, and that BRT system had its own right of way, and it was built to cover the needs of Ottawa. But that was back in the '90s, and a few years ago they converted that BRT to a light rail line using that right of way. Um, and I mean that's tricky because that does get expensive, and now it's another big, huge project that can be shot down, that can be cut back in various different ways, that can get BRT creep or LRT creep, as they say, where they start to pick little pieces off of it to make it less efficient than it should be. But I think that Ottawa did fairly well with that. They ran into their own problems with their LRT related to the fact that nobody remembered how to build a train anymore, and it was the blind leading the blind.
Right.
But but the idea here there is that they were able to do that. They were able to say like, this is a BRT, and we're going to make it useful. We're going to make it go where you want to go. It goes through the downtown. It connects to various neighborhoods. They built some density around it. It became quite popular, and then it outgrew BRT-ness and had to become an LRT. And I think that's entirely possible. But when we're talking about North America, of course, in most cases, we're way back before that. We're not at BRT level. We're at please let a bus run more than every 45 minutes level.
Right.
And I think, you mentioned this in your book too. Like let's get some buses in here. Let's get them running more often. Let's get them to the point where you don't need to think so much about the schedule. Let we can then start to say, okay, well, they're getting stuck in traffic. Let's at least give them some left turn lanes that they can use to bypass some of the signals, and let's start to give them sections of the road that are only for them, and then you can go from there. But really, what we need to do is we need to start looking at, again, this whole land use transit thing together. We need to start looking at the places that have potential and connecting them together with transit. And then we need to look at the places that have transit and figuring out some way to make them at least somewhat walkable around them. Not this avenues plan that Toronto does, which is insane, but actually saying, look, within 15 minutes of this station, it's all it's all going to be this, that, whatever. Maybe it isn't towers. Maybe it isn't single family homes. But maybe they'll say It can be townhouses. It can be small apartments. It could be these kind of things. It we have to start doing this because that's where a transit plan is built. And again, coming back to it, when I was asked on CBC Radio, what's the solution for Wonderland Road? There is no solution for Wonderland Road. The solution is we need to look at the whole city, and we need to look at the way that people get around and the way that people live and the way that you can develop things. And we need to have a cohesive plan here that can build the seeds of a transit system, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about building the seeds of a transit system that can grow over time to be something useful. And then we can solve Wonderland Road.
I think it's a beautiful answer. I know a lot of people, one of the curiosities of you over here in the US is just your lifestyle. Can you tell us the last transit trip you took? Just as like, where'd you go and what'd you do?
The last transit trip I took. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is here we cycle an awful lot, but yeah, I took a transit
We'll
trip
talk about your
with
last
my
cycling trip.
well, and even before we get to that, I will talk about my last transit trip because I did it with my kids. We went to the Science Museum here, and you know, we wanted to go out. They're out of school now for the summer, and we have what are called museum cards that get us into all the museums for free, so we can pop by for a few hours anytime we want. And we took the metro there. We walked over to the tram station. We took the tram up to the local metro stop. We took the metro up to Amsterdam Central. We walked to the museum, and you know, it was the three of us. My wife had to work, but I had the off for the day because of the summer, and yeah, that's what we did. And that's a normal thing to do, right? Like that's a
Right.
perfectly normal thing to do. But the reason why that's possible is because we live within a few hundred meters of a tram stop. Because we can, and because when we get to the station, we can walk to the Science Museum. It's a perfectly feasible thing to do, even for young children.
Yeah. How's your Dutch?
My Dutch is actually getting pretty good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know you've been working on it.
yeah, and I'm signing up for my exams. They're called the NT2 exams. I think I'm going to do the B1 level. Anybody who's familiar with the levels there, I could probably pass the B2, but I'm going to go with the B1 level and then start working on naturalization process and getting a Dutch passport.
Well, will you do me a gratuitous favor? Will you say in Dutch, keep doing what you can to build strong town?
I actually don't know how I would say keep doing, because it's a very English expression, but do the goed werk that you do at Strong Towns, and yeah.
Thank you. Jason Slaughter, the YouTube channel is Not Just Bikes. If you're not watching it, you're missing out on a ton. Jason, it's so nice to see you and to chat again. Let's do this again. I love every time your video comes out, we're part of your Patreon, and I get them a couple of days in advance, and I always watch them. It's always good fun. How can people, besides the YouTube channel, how can people support you? There's the Patreon. I know you've got another channel that you're dabbling in. Can you just take a couple minutes and tell people where they can follow your stuff?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, obviously the best place is YouTube. It's Not Just Bikes. If you search Not Just Bikes, you can't miss it. It's so big these days. Last month it had 8 million views. So it's the first thing that pops up when you search.
I'm
for
so happy
Not Just
about
Bikes.
that. I am
It's
so
crazy.
happy about that. Yes.
I'm actually really, really happy that there's so many people in North America and in other parts of the world that are opening their eyes to this stuff.
Yeah.
My fans call it getting orange pilled. That their eyes are
Yeah.
open to the, and then they can never see the world the same way again, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, because sometimes people are happy in their ignorance. But anyway, so yeah, Not Just Bikes on YouTube. There's the Patreon. I put some extra videos on a service called Nebula as well, so you can sign up for Nebula, which has lots of other creators, including City Beautiful. So, but yeah, search Not Just Bikes. You'll find me. Can't miss it. I'm on some other platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, but it's mostly around YouTube.
Jason, thanks so much. Thanks for taking the time, especially with the time zone difference. I appreciate it. I still plan to get over there and see you someday soon, and I hope you can make it to Brainerd. We'll hang out. Maybe go to Disney World together and
we will figure it out. It'll be
American
good fun.
Transit. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Take care.